Welcome to Circular Firing Squad. I'm Marty, a counseling faculty at Kent State University and host for Circular Firing Squad. We've been at this for 4 years. I was working on my Vita and I was trying to put in these shows on my resume. And so I had to go back and look at dates to figure out when was the show that we did after July 1st last year in order to get it into a summary fashion for my annual report, and went all the way back and found out our first show was this week 4 years ago.
Wow.
And
the anniversary.
Pandemic land.
Yeah. Well, no, we were in pandemic.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
yeah.
100%. After March of 2020, it was pandemic world.
And we started. That's right. We started it in May. Yeah.
It was the pandemic brought us together and made us feel social.
Yeah, it was really helpful.
Yeah. And of course,
we're still doing it, but yeah, that was, especially in the pandemic, that was really helpful.
Yeah. We've got 3 of the original, 2 new. We have a couple of original that aren't with us tonight. Gina she sent a picture of her with her kids running around at the beach, which is really a way to rub it in. Gina, you might think you've got a good excuse, but you've just made it worse. And Eric is probably running around with his kids in the house, so he's not with us tonight. So we're going to do this episode. Let's find out who's with us.
Hi, everybody. I'm one of the newbies, Brittany Pollard-Kozadowski, professor of counseling at Indiana University of Pennsylvania.
Hi, everyone. Elliott Ingersoll, professor of counseling at Cleveland State University, host of Apply Topically, and with the warmer weather, wearer of short socks.
Hi, I'm Steph Martyr. I am a doctoral candidate at Kent State University and practicing clinical counselor.
What's up, everybody? Mitch Conrad, 3rd year, I think, graduate student in clinical mental health counseling at Cleveland State University and newly minted counselor trainee.
Britt, you've got the first question.
All right. What are some famous gaffes in psychotherapy or counseling films that just crack you up?
I love this question because I had shared with Marty a while back. It would be great to be able to do a mystery science theater style kind of show about some of these older psychotherapy films. There's a couple that really stand out, but I gotta go back to the Gloria films. I mean, first off, Albert Ellis looks like Jerry Lewis on LSD. I mean, he's just all over the place. He's yammering and chattering away a mile a minute, and he's like going so fast, I don't think anyone's following him. That part alone, it's cringeworthy, but it's also, he must have been like feeling competitive stress. But Fritz Perls, and I don't think it's a great Gestalt therapy session. I think there's moments, but I cannot, I'm not advocating Botox, but I keep looking at these dark circles under Fritz's eyes, and I'm like, Fritz, check those bags at the desk, man. Come on, you're on film here. A little makeup, a little something, I don't know. And there was another one, a gentleman and a lady, I think they're North Carolina, UC, maybe Chapel Hill, I don't know. They did a good series of psychotherapy videos, but at one point this gentleman asks one of the theorists, is that like a metaphor? And I'm thinking if it was like a metaphor, it would be a simile, Anyway, those are some of my favorites. Great question. Thank you, Britt.
I'm embarrassed now, Britt, because I was talking to everybody before the show and I was like, oh, I have an answer for this question. I completely misread the question in my mind. My brain saw a different kind of question. And so I apologize in advance for all the actual serious sounding answers. My answer was serious for me thinking like what famous gaffes in films that were like, that included psychology and counseling. So I was saying like, what about Bob?
That's how I thought of it. Totally fine.
Okay. I appreciate that. Yeah. Cause I'm like, this is not theorists talking and stuff, but yes. What about Bob? The boundaries, all of that. Obviously I don't know. At the time it was funny. It's still really, really uncomfortable when I think about watching the movie, like when I think about when I watched it, because I don't think I'll watch it again because it's such an uncomfortable movie. But A to Z, a gaffe for a counselor or a psychotherapist to make.
So my brain also immediately went to like popular films. And I was sort of thinking like, well, what in popular films have I even seen that like is counselory sort of enough? I kind of went to like that one scene in Wreck-It Ralph where all the unquote villains, right, are like sitting around and having a group therapy session. That was sort of like what I thought of first, but I don't remember exactly like any sort of like gaffes in there. But I was sort of thinking about this question in terms of gaffes and listening to what Dr. I said about the Gloria tapes. And so I've heard some responses to, I assume the Gloria tapes are showed in a lot of counselor programs, right? And so I've heard some responses to the Gloria tapes that do make me wonder, sort of like how we're sort of conceptualizing like what happened in those tapes, because I think like sometimes we look at those tapes from a 2024 lens, and not a whenever the Gloria tapes came out. I don't remember if it was the 60s or the 70s. I feel like it was the 70s, but whenever those tapes came out, right, we have three therapists there, I think, who do like get a bad rap sometimes, like not right. I think mostly like Ellis and Pearls, but who do get a bad rap sometimes for like their behavior during those sessions. It's like, oh God, like Laurel Club's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that someone would say that. And I sort of think like at some point, those dudes were likely, very likely, doing exactly what they thought was most effective for the client at the time. And so I have to like sort of acknowledge that, even though like I see some of that and I think, oh, well, I certainly like would not use that now, clearly. But I think we also have to acknowledge like the contributions that, being willing, not just for Gloria, but for them too, to sit down and have a session and showcase like what that might look like.
Gloria, but really couldn't find anything that was gaffy in that. And maybe because I was looking at it from Mitch's standpoint, maybe because I figured I was going to be fifth to answer this question or fourth to answer this question, and somebody by then would have already gotten to Gloria. Didn't think of popular films, but I'm reaching deep here. There is a film that John Carlson did in his series of interviewing or demonstrating different theorists and different theoretical approaches. And it was with Bob, I'm going to mess up the name, Bob Wabudlung, who did reality therapy. And he was paired with a client who was so off the planet with his thinking. He was thinking in the 20,000 feet above the ground, and reality therapy is very much on the ground, was struggling to try and demonstrate this reality therapy approach with him. And the client was just going off on all these wild, well, you could say I might do that, but then there'd be a lot of people who would say no, and he would just kind of go free floating all over the place. And it's cringeworthy for those of us who know reality therapy, because you see the therapist trying to really get this person grounded in this approach, and this guy is not having any, it's not resistance. It's just they paired him with this guy who was totally spaced and out there. So for me, when I think of cringeworthy, I've used that film once or twice, and I think, and I know Dr. Wabudlong is still alive, very kind to interview with us last year on the master class, but I think it's a poor example of reality therapy, not because of him not trying, but because the client they paired him with.
Thank you all so much. I think there are so many great examples, both from popular film and training videos that we've all seen and or used. My initial thought was about a popular TV show these days called Shrinking. I don't know if any of you have seen it, with Jason Segel. It's meant to be funny, but he says just about anything and everything you would never want to say or do with a client. And so you have to take it with a grain of salt, but I find it pretty humorous. But as we've been talking, I've actually thought back to the stand videos that Gerald Corey did, which I use often in theories. And one of my students this spring was so excited by watching the Stan videos that he actually reached out to Stan himself, who's a professor of counselor education at Arizona State, Dr. Jamie Bloodworth. And he ended up zooming in and doing like a Q&A for us, and it was amazing. But I think my favorite video is the Gestalt video, where Corey asks Stan to reenact a bathroom scene in the midst of the session, and just the way that the tape is edited, it comes across hilariously. So if you haven't watched that in a hot minute, I encourage you to look it up. We had a good laugh with Dr. Bloodworth about it, and Gerald Corey asking him to reenact some pretty unsavory things without meaning to. So if you're out there, Jerry or Dr. Bloodworth, we all enjoy your videos. Thank you.
They're a Korean good time. Next question. And I know that there's many films you could answer with, but I'm not saying the most important one, but what's a film that stands out for you that changed how you viewed the world, and what were some of the changes?
I mean, this was tough in that there could be many of them, from different times. There were more of them when I was younger. Things were more eye-opening and interesting and exciting when I was younger, even though a lot of those films still stay with me. Then I was trying to think of like something more recent, just because. And then I found something in the middle. And I guess that was, because I know I'll get there, but I've talked about watching The Matrix before. That was an answer to a question not that long ago that was somewhat similar, but also different from this. And then there was something much more recent, which I don't think it changed my view of the world in any way, but Sorry to Bother You is such a cool movie. And it helped me recontextualize in some ways, perhaps, themes of that movie. And I just also appreciated the visual, just the whole, I can't say anything about it. So if anyone ever watches it, if you know, as they say. But I'm going to go with the whole slew of Forks Over Knives and all of those movies. Because it really showed that even when you think you're buying something that comes from a humane place or is done in a humane way or is without things that you don't want in it food wise, that, just more of the truth, and also how bad in some ways. I'm not trying to get on a high horse, but it made me think about what I did with my life and the choices I made. And I still make different choices today based on.
So I feel like I have a tendency to pick some Japanese anime for these type of film questions. So we're going to go right back there. Really love A Silent Voice. It's a movie that came out in, I think, 2020 or so, but it's about a deaf student who comes into school and is bullied. And it really, I think, showcases how traumatic sometimes bullying can be. And I don't use the word trauma lightly there. I use it intentionally because I don't think that at least in psychology, I don't think that psychology or psychiatry maybe would be more specific, would diagnose something like bullying or consider something like bullying as trauma. It doesn't in, for instance, the DSM-5 TR. But I think that, and I'm convinced, particularly people can define their own trauma, right? And if we're limiting it to only specific things, then I think we're sort of missing a portion of the population that has it, or could receive that diagnosis, for instance. But I think this film, to me, really showed not just the how traumatic bullying can be, but also how important necessarily that human connection is, and how important kindness is inside of schools. I'm someone who, really is looking in, I have some passion surrounding bullying prevention. And that's been something that's been on my radar. One of the reasons that I got into counseling, right, was to work with adolescents. And I assumed that many of those adolescents would have experienced bullying. And so this is a great film if you're interested in sort of that kind of subject about what something like that could look like. Maybe you were homeschooled, maybe you went to a private school, maybe you didn't experience much bullying growing up in your life. Although I think that I know better. I think that most of us did. I think it's a really excellent film, won a ton of awards. I think it actually came out probably a little bit earlier than 2020. I think maybe I'm looking towards 2015 or 2016, but Silent Voice, wonderful movie. Check it out.
Okay, Mitch, time for me to go back 50 years before then. I was 13 years old in 1970, and my dad and I never did much together. I mean, we just didn't do things together. He was around. He was a great dad. all of that. But we didn't do, but at one point he said, "Hey, you want to go see a movie with me?" And he was fascinated by this movie that I guess he had heard of at the office, and he knew that I might be interested in it too. 2001: A Space Odyssey. It had just, well, it was the theater we saw it in kind of had late run. So it wasn't really first run. It had probably been out for a couple of, probably been out for more than a couple of months. And it finally made it to the patio, which was, or no, the Luna, which was the theater in our neighborhood. And so we went over and saw it together. And first of all, it's important and memorable to me because it was something I did with my dad that he didn't do with the rest of the family. It was just he and I. And then secondly, it was as a 13-year-old, what the hell did I just see? Which was cool for me. Frankly, it started me down the road of reading a lot of science fiction, not fantasy, but science fiction. I never went the fantasy route. And also getting really interested in films. So I've mentioned this before on the show that I had a minor in aesthetic English, or what was the name they called films back in the late 70s. And we didn't see 2001. I was thinking of some great films we saw in the classes that I took. But man, that set me up. I can't look at movies in any other way. It's the template. Eventually I got around to seeing Citizen Kane and all those ones that you consider classic cinematography. But you can't look at film anymore after you see it the same way after you see 2001. And that might have been the eyes of a 13-year-old, but it got me when it needed to get me.
I think mine would probably be Life is Beautiful, which was a Holocaust focused movie in the mid to late 90s. So I would have been somewhere between 10 and 13, and just sort of figuring out some of the horrors of the world and the realities of eras that I had certainly learned about in school, but probably not visualized much beyond a textbook or a classroom. And thinking back, I would imagine that was probably my first introduction to the idea of meaning making, even though I wouldn't have language for that for another 10, 20 years, whatever. But now as a humanist practitioner, thinking about the idea of meaning making and making the best of one's circumstances and all that life has to offer, even when things are at their worst, has always just been a really powerful message that sort of resonates with me. And, looking back, that film where a man and his son are in a concentration camp and he's doing his best to have his son think that they're part of a game to make the circumstances, better. I think that was probably my real first introduction to, I guess, existential thinking and just sort of a new way of looking at the world.
Wonderful answers. Mitch, I'm going to check that film out that you talked about. That sounds really good. I think my response is somewhat akin to Marty's in that the first film my parents took us to, or me to, my sister had been to a couple before. It was Mary Poppins, 1964, and I saw it in the theater, and it was outside of Youngstown, Boardman Plaza Theater. It was a big screen, and they actually had a curtain, and before the film would start, they'd open the curtain to show the screen, and it was just kind of cool. I got imprinted in a lot of ways. Dick Van Dyke's kind of one-man band thing he does in the park, I actually ended up doing that professionally. Figured out a way to do it. I'll never forget it. I thought, oh, that's great. You have everything right where you need it at your hands and feet. But on a deeper level, it was the first time there's a really great message about for adults about parenting and about existential freedom, and it was the first time I realized, oh, parents have problems too, not just like kids. And it set a template. I'm halfway through. I've written half of a musical that shows Mary Poppins as an existential drama. And it's very existential. And I even reworked some of the songs, the supercalifragilistic, existential, Dostoevsky, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. If you like to read them, you might think that they are freaky. Nietzsche got beat up at schools because his shoes were squeaky. Existential, Dostoevsky, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. I mean, I got a whole bunch of them, but yeah. So yeah, and I think that probably steered me toward existential therapy. And, here I am. So if you don't like the results, blame Mary Poppins, who's practically perfect in every respect. So I wouldn't do it, but
Wow. The talent, you see, people have these hidden gifts And I'm glad they get to come through during the podcast because that was no, I thought it was great though. There is part brilliant. I'm going to take us off of film probably, even though I think we should have like a film themed episode one time. But I would like to ask you all, what is a new skill you have recently acquired?
So I'm kind of going to cheat here because I'm not sure if I've acquired any new skill lately, but I feel like I've refined one, which has become really important. And that's writing. And it hasn't just been about writing, sort of like papers inside the program. I started writing a book that I hope to publish sometime, or have someone else publish for me. I haven't gotten that far yet, but I'm about I'd say I'm about like 65,000 words in, which is probably about half of something. And I didn't know if I could ever sit down and actually like write something. I mean, you got to start somewhere, right? Like I imagine people here have written stuff and published stuff before, and I've had a research article published before, and it's something that I was surprised at how it actually became something that was a skill that developed. And I'm not saying that my writing is skillful. I'm more along the lines talking about like how quickly I can write now. And I mean, write school papers now, right? When I'm sitting down and writing a paper, it takes me about, not quite as long anymore to be able to sit down and write. And I think that's probably from the practice skill of like, hey, I'm looking at research articles online. I'm trying to come up with some creative stuff on my own, and write narrative stuff. And it all kind of joins together into a more fluid process, sort of like with all writing. And so like practicing like a skill in one way ends up, generalizing for me to, schoolwork. And I imagine that schoolwork is sort of doing the same for the book. And so that's kind of exciting for me.
Not a fan of this question. It was tough to figure out. And but I just figured it out about a minute ago. And it turned out using and searching RSS news feeds. I've used news feeds before just to kind of go through them, but I'm doing a weekly podcast now on Vision Pro, the Apple headset. And part of the podcast is to present stories that have come out in the last week on Vision Pro. And so, first of all, gathering all the sources in RSS and figuring out, then having RSS search and find articles, Twitter feeds, things that had to do with the topic of the Apple Vision Pro is a newfound skill. And, I was cheating a little bit. I was looking at somebody else's blog on it. And, but I've gotten to the skill level where I'm further along with finding stuff than some of the sources I go to. So that would be my very boring new skill that I'm sure I'm not in a challenge with anybody for it, but searching RSS news feeds.
I wish I had as an impressive an answer as either of you. I did not have an answer for this until this morning when I discovered that if I try hard enough, I can assemble furniture on my own. So I am the proud new owner and putter together of an entire patio set. All by myself. My husband and I were supposed to do it together, and I caught a wind this morning and let him sleep in and tackled it. And by the time he was up, it was done, and it stayed together, knock on wood, this far. So I am not a mechanically inclined person. So you know what? Rather than deflect, I'm going to own this. I'm pretty proud of myself, and it looks good today. We'll see how long that lasts.
I think that's a great answer because my son, we got porch furniture, and he's like, "Do you want to help me put it together?" I was like, "Nah, I'm good." I'm like, I don't do well. He did it himself. I mean, he had the whole thing put together, and it was wonderful. But yeah, I appreciate that. That's a good skill. I think mine is a psychological one, it was sort of a umbrella skill. I got my first knee replacement, so I got my robo knee, and having to slow down, and that's just been the hardest thing. Even hobbling around with a cane, I felt like I was moving at light speed compared to like the recovery from the surgery. Surprised at how long it took. But, all the physical therapy things and occupational therapy things that they were teaching me were all about breaking things into chunks, slowing it down, making sure you got each piece. And I had never looked at slowing down existentially in that manner. So that was really actually kind of helpful. And when I get the other one done, I've got all the skills now, hopefully. The thing I hated was the walker. My doctor, when I was coming up the hall right after the surgery, he's like, "How do you feel?" I said, "I feel like I'm serving drinks on an airplane." "I'm sorry, sir, we don't have Coca-Cola products here." I could just move an inch at a time. It was very aggravating. But so that was my micro skills, and then the umbrella skill of existential patience.
So I was trying to have answers for this question. I couldn't remember exactly what I was thinking of when I said it, but just a couple minutes before we started recording, I realized posting and selling things on Facebook Marketplace. It's something that, usually in the past I hadn't really considered. And then I looked around and we had a whole lot of stuff and I was just like, why not? And just like, it just started going and it's just going. And, luckily there's a Starbucks right on my block, like around the corner. So I can just go and meet everybody there. So I don't have half the county coming to my house. But it's been really good. It's kind of put some of my faith back in humanity. But I didn't know I could do this.
All right, let's importantly stick to a hypothetical question here. If you could break one law without consequence, what would it be and why?
I hated this question up to about a minute ago because I took law as literal, and this might be my real answer. Electronic bank theft. If I could do that, take a whole lot of cash and donate it for a worthy cause. Some of these guys who have billions and billions of dollars, they're not as you don't need that much money to live on. So why not just take it and invest it in some good, purposeful cause or research? So that was my first answer. But then I looked at it and I said, well, why can't I break the law of gravity? Then I said, nah, gravity, what can you do with gravity? I've been watching the Kong movies with the underworld where there's that point where gravity flips on them. And so I thought gravity, well, that would be cool. But what do you do with that? And then I thought, let's go to relativity. Let's break Einstein's law of relativity. And then we can do some really fun stuff with time and space. So as I'm giving these three answers, I'm watching everybody groan because I might have stolen one. So who's up next?
It's me, and you didn't steal mine because I didn't think about that at all. My first thought was the Robin Hood sort of thing as well. Let's steal from the rich to give to the poor. But I don't want to repeat. So I'm going to say something really silly, which is I wish I didn't have to get my car inspected every year and no one would ever notice my sticker. There didn't even have to be stickers. In Michigan, where I grew up, this is not a thing. You can drive a rust bucket down the road and nobody cares. And I did. Here in PA, for all kinds of reasons that I'm sure are just valid and all the good things, they make us do it every year and I hate it. So there's my lame answer. What'd you say, Elliott?
The Commonwealth.
Yeah, gotta love the Commonwealth.
Those are great answers. I had one that was after I thought about it for a while, and that would be just income tax. Don't worry about that. Then a lot of other problems are solved. It's kind of got that. And then if I have extra, I can give it away. So yeah. But my first thought was it kind of revealed why a life in crime is not in the books for me. Probably. I thought, when I was a little kid, my favorite show was Lost in Space. And people say, that was barely science fiction, but it was a fun show. I still like the reruns. But they had this jetpack, and I saw one on a James Bond movie. I think it's Thunderball. But I'm like, I would steal a jetpack because that would be so cool. But then, of course, after thinking that's what I would do, I was like, well, that's not going to last long. I mean, people aren't going to be sitting around. How are we going to catch this guy who stole the jetpack? I don't know, maybe look up. It's so I would get to enjoy it for a couple of days at most, probably. But there it is.
I guess I was thinking along the same lines as many of you because I said insider trading. So, I mean, I just want people to tell me what to do because they have all of the information and then bim, bam, boom. Oops. Yeah, I just guessed really well.
I think you're allowed to do that in Congress. But anyway, thanks everybody for your answers. Marty, I really appreciated your answer. I was sort of thinking along those same lines, right? Like, what about breaking something like the law of gravity or the law of relativity? I'm feeling extra petty today. So I'm going to break the law of paid parking at my university and just be able to park there free. I'm sure that if I could break that law for everybody else, we'd all really love it. That would just be fantastic, right? Just imagine like not having to pay $1,000 a year for a place that you work at. Wouldn't that be something? But anyway, that's just my 2 cents.
Well, that was fun. Your answers were the way my mind should have been thinking, but I was kind of out there in space. So I've got a question. We've been doing this for 4 years. When I saw 4 years, I was surprised because it didn't feel like 4 years, but we've been doing this for 4 years. So my question is, what's the biggest change for you in the last 4 years?
I hate that I'm answering this first. Mine feels like a real downer, but losing my mom has reshaped my entire life. My outlook on things, the way I experience things, the goals I have for myself, the way my family is structured, obviously. Certainly I can recognize 4 years in some things that have grown as a result of that loss and that experience, but absolutely, that would be the biggest change. And I don't want to get too political here, but I do think, and probably certainly beyond the last 4 years as well, but I've certainly gotten more jaded and cynical, just looking at the world and interacting with folks and seeing how things have unfolded in this country. So I'll leave that there.
Yeah, boy, this hit a little harder for me than I expected because, like, Britt, you'd shared about loss and losing my mom on Labor Day. But in the last 4 years, the biggest change, my health has crashed and burned because I remember we had just had our lockdown and we started the podcast and I was like, oh, this is a great idea. And then I got COVID and then I got the long COVID and like all these things. And it was just like one thing after another. But, being at this point 4 years later, I feel like I am finally kind of coming back from that. But it was just like, boy, it's like in martial arts when they keep sending fresh opponents and you can't do anything. You just keep getting knocked down and it's like, that's all you can do. But yeah, it's been probably qualitatively the most radical 4-year shift in my adulthood, I would say. Thanks, COVID.
I mean, that in and of itself for a lot of us, it's just funny because that would be like the first in a stream perhaps of like those major changes, right? That was a big change. Also 2 months ago, Mike his job is transitioning. He's transitioning employment. So this is a big change. But in the last 4 years, the biggest change has been adding Nora to our family. There's no way around it. Everything is different. Everything is, for us better, and just feels more complete, but oh boy, has everything changed.
Yeah, this was a challenging question for me because I think you could even cut it in half and go like, what's the biggest change for you in the last 2 or 2.5 years? And I'd feel like be overwhelmed with the amount of things that I could answer. So I'll go with the one that I guess makes the most sort of day-to-day sense, which is going back to graduate school and going for this profession as a counselor. I wanted to do this since I was 13, right? And it's been a long time coming. Seeing finally seeing clients and the next 2 weeks here is radical to me. Like this idea that 2 years ago that I would have been here ready to do that is sort of I don't know how. Sometimes I don't know how I got here, not in like a bad way or anything like that, but obviously like the answer of like, returning back and like doing wanting to do counseling, that that never really changed for me. That's always been something that's been there. It's just like what of that change, what meaning inside of that idea of going back and doing counseling change, right? And so like for me, it's always been or there was a switch, right, for me in the past year where it was like, I want to counsel, where before it was like, I want to counsel adolescents and provide therapy to adolescents. It's like, no, I want to provide psychedelic assisted therapy full time, right? And that's a big switch to do inside of a graduate program and sort of go like, okay, well, I can't provide that to adolescents, So, it's sort of like my, things that I want to do inside of the field don't necessarily fit as well together. And it's sort of like picking and choosing which priority to have. I imagine that I'll always, I might always have a few adolescents on my caseload that I'm not providing psychedelic assisted therapy to. But at the same time, I think, clearly moved in like a more specific direction. And so like, I imagine that I'll have a very similar answer even 2 years from now after I, get my LPC.
This was an easy one for me, but since I came up with this answer, it's gotten bigger and bigger. So I'll start out with the answer. Cancer, having a diagnosis, surgery, and at this point, successful remission of cancer. But then I remember this podcast started 4 years ago, and it was Stephanie and Elliott that reminded, we started this just when COVID started, just after when COVID started. And it was a kind of necessary way for us to feel connected again. So the cancer piece ties into that with the fact that I'm over 65. My spouse is over 65. And there were times where we were, shelter and care, just kind of lying on the bed and thinking, okay, it doesn't look good. We both have pre-existing conditions. So this whole question about life and death has happened since COVID and has been triggered by my own health concern with cancer, but that's been a good thing. I mean, it has changed sort of my viewpoint about what's important. And I was always one of those people that somebody else got cancer, not me. And I feel sorry for them. They must be going through some difficult time, until it came home. And then it was like, oh, I get a lot of this now. So that was my big change, I think, over the last 4 years, was not just the illness, not just the question about life and death when COVID came around, but just the whole idea of the importance of what existence gives to us as a gift, which I didn't think much of prior to 4 years ago. So that's the planned questions. Now I have one final shot question for everybody. What's your plans for summer?
Teaching until July and taking the rest of the summer off. Cannot wait. And I'm not putting any more furniture together.
Yeah, I've got 2 sections of practicum, which that's an exciting class for me because I don't get to do a lot of clinical stuff through the year. Yeah, and I'm just getting my health back to wherever the new normal is. And, my brain keeps reminding me of the developmental trajectory that I'm getting older too, and I shouldn't expect to work out like when I was 50. And that sounds silly. Who aspires to like, oh, I wish I could work out like when I was 50? Well, it happens, folks, but don't let it get you down.
Come on, Brittany. All hail the Allen wrench. Well, besides working on my dissertation, part of Mike's transition is he's going to be going to conventions and selling equipment that he created. And with that there's like 5 or 6 conventions, so that's gonna be days at a time that he's gonna be out of town. So I'm going to be scheduling that time as much as possible to entertain Nora. So just anything I can do, anywhere I can take her. I will be doing the song and dance, wearing the flippers and the ski mat, whatever it is. We will be entertaining Nora.
We should get Nora on one of the podcasts. All things Nora. That'd be a subsection. I think that'd be great.
She's perfect for it. She'd take you up on that.
Let's see. So I'm obviously in Dr. I's prac class. Also taking human sexuality course with Dr. Stacy Leetom. Really enjoying that class so far as well. Mentioned earlier writing a book on psychedelic assisted therapy, psychedelic integration therapy, and other topics. And so that's sort of like what I've got planned for the summer is school, book, and then also, right, like I'm going to start seeing clients here. So sort of a professional sounding summer, but that's sort of how I like it, I guess.
Yeah, I would say probably before this podcast, I would have said all these things I'm going to do, but apparently I'm going to be editing this podcast for the rest of the summer. Yeah, I got to teach. I've got some teaching. I've assumed some program duties, so I have to get those straightened out. But I'm looking for that magical date in July that I think Britt is waiting for too, when classes end and I take off the next day and go to do 2 presentations at Macstock. One on AI, which is going to be a workshop, and then another one that's going to be called Apple Whisperers, how to not be the tech support that all your relatives want from you. And then after that, I think Aileen and I are trying to plan a driving vacation, maybe Nova Scotia, maybe Upper New York again. We'll see, but we have that month off. And if the university and the students will leave me alone for that month, I'd be very, very happy. But I plan to get some good rest in. So what are you going to be doing for the rest of your summer? What are your plans? Well, hopefully it'll be listening to Circular Firing Squad. Thanks for the firing squad, Steph, Brittany, Elliott, and Mitch for joining us tonight. You can find out more about them at circularfiringsquad.net. Make sure to check out the Tech Savvy Professor podcast hosted by Eric and myself, and the Vision Profiles podcast about Apple Vision Pro. Our theme music is from Menage a Quad, Real Swing Chef. That's it for this episode of Circular Firing Squad. Ready, fire, aim.